Hello, gentlemen. Thank you for your patience. We started a little late here because we were waiting for folks to return from the Stations of the Cross. I imagine we'll probably have some more people coming in here as they continue to wrap up. So we have Karen Wingard and Pam Knott here today, who are speakers for Shroud Talks. And Bill Wingard is the original Shroud Talks presenter since 2014 and has given over 100 talks on the Shroud of Turin. Back in 1982, he heard an early Shroud presentation made by a member of the 1978 STURP scientific team. According to his wife Karen, Bill's blow-by-blow detailed recount to her was even better than the talk she was able to hear a year later. When Bill decided to begin giving talks on the Shroud of Turin, he learned its history and message along with him and has accompanied him for most of his 100 presentations. Bill and Karen have been married for 44 years and have raised 5 children. She has a background in accounting. She has homeschooled their children, taught at the Baltimore County Community College, and earned a master's in theology from the Augustine Institute. They currently live in Shrewsbury, PA. While Bill is recovering from health issues, Karen and Pam Knott have been filling in for him. Before they come up here and begin, I did want to ask, after this presentation is over, if we could have a few men come up and help with the disassembly of everything so we can prepare for Mass. We would appreciate it. But please join me in welcoming Karen Wingard and Pam Knott.
Can everybody hear me? Great. It's great to be here. Bill would love to be here, but he's still recovering from some health issues. It's his passion to talk about the passion of Christ and how much Jesus suffered for us because he loved us and wanted us to have eternity with him. And the Shroud of Turin is often called the fifth gospel because without saying a word, it shows all that he suffered for us. It shows him in death. It also shows the resurrection because there's no decomposition. There's no body decaying. So how many people are already familiar with the shroud? Most of you. Okay, great. Just to clarify, shroud means a burial cloth, and it's called the Shroud of Turin because it's been in Turin since the 1500s, but it didn't originate there. That's part of it. So we have here an exact photocopy of the shroud as it was in 1978 when the scientific team examined it. Barry Schwartz was the scientific photographer. He helped put this PowerPoint together. A lot of these are his photos, and he helped mentor Bill. We went to visit his house in the back of Pikes Peak. So since 2002, we went to see the shroud in 2015. In 2002, they took off the backing cloth and it no longer, and they redid the patches. So if you come up here, you can actually see the stitches that were made by the poor Clare nuns from the fire in 1500s. But when we went, I couldn't see anything. You'll be able to see much better here. And this is a Jubilee here, but they said the shroud's it's too fragile right now to be exposed. So you won't be able to see it this year. I don't know when you'll be able to see it. So please come up and look. And if you take pictures and then do reverse image, you'll get the same image that's on these photographic negatives. These are Kodak Duraflex back from, when we used to have actual negatives instead of just point and click with our phones now. So these can't be made anymore. So again, these show the details that sparked the scientific interest in the shroud. So let me just explain using this image, and I'm going to learn how to use the laser pointer. So what most people notice are these lines. These are the burn lines And those are the patches that the poor Clare nuns. So you can see how the material was folded. We'll go into the fire, but those are all patches from a fire in the 1500s. The image of Jesus is in between. So here's his head. You can see that, and here's, you can see, let me make sure I've got this, yeah. And here's the blood stains on the arms. Over here's this back, there's water stains in the middle. Here's the back, and you can see all the lash marks on the back. And it's the most studied artifact in history. People have pored over this. They're all still trying to figure out how the image was formed. So I can tell you some of the latest theories, but they're all still theories because the resurrection's a unique event and hasn't been duplicated yet. So we'll talk about what is this, where did it come from, and what does it tell us? This is a picture by Salvador Dali. It shows the Father looking down on the Son, who's looking down on us. And they'll call it the theme because the Father loves us through the Son. Before I go on, I didn't replenish our supply, so I don't have enough of these shroud cards for everybody, but if you're interested, we have some up here. This has the image that's from the negative. The image on the shroud is inside. And if you want to watch the free YouTube or contact Bill for lining up a talk, that information's on the back of the card. So they're up here. Okay, this gives you an image of how Jesus was laid in the cloth. So it wasn't like an Egyptian mummy. He was laid feet at one end, head in the middle. They pulled the cloth over his head and then put some linen strips to hold it in place when they carried him to the tomb. And then you can see the angels are holding the image up above. And 1625 was after the fire, so it has scorch marks on it. Okay, so it's one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of the world. These are some of the scientists that were examining it in 1978. But we're going to start with the history, then we'll go to the science, and then we'll go to the passion, and Mary Pam will be giving that part. So in scripture, we know that Joseph of Arimathea gave his tomb, but he also provided the fine linen cloth that Jesus was buried in. There was a face cloth that was found wrapped up neatly on the side in the Gospel of John at resurrection, but there was also the cloth that was left. Now, Bishop Barron talked about the shroud in his Easter homily, and one of the things he commented is some people say, well, Jesus' body was stolen. And he said, if you're going to steal a body, you're going to take it out of the cloth. And it was expensive cloth. That was more valuable than the body. So he was just trying to say that that argument doesn't make sense. Now, there's a couple of theories because the beginning, a lot of the history is shrouded in mystery. There's some accounts that have the shroud going immediately to Edessa. The account that Bill thinks is more likely is that Peter, when he was bishop of Antioch for 2 years, took it to Antioch. So one reason we may not hear about it in the Bible is in the Jewish scriptures, blood and dead people make you ritually unclean, which is why the Good Samaritan, the priest and the Levite, didn't want to touch the bloodied up, almost dead man. But the Samaritan, not being Jewish, didn't have that problem. Antioch was where a lot of Gentiles became Christian. It was, in the Roman Empire, it was the third largest city after Rome and Alexandria. So it's very possible that Peter might have taken the shroud there. And it would have stayed until there was a threat of invasion by the Persians, in which case the relics were taken to Edessa. Oh, and here's a terracotta image of Antioch. So it went to Edessa. There was an early Christian city in modern Turkey. Now, so in 525 was the first certain appearance. We're not sure how long it had been there. We know that it became Christian early on, but then some of the kings were pagan. And it seems what happened, there was a big flood. They had numerous floods, but there was a really big flood and they had to redo a lot of the walls. And when they were redoing one of the gates, the openings over the city, they opened up a stone, and lo and behold, there was this container that had an image. They recognized it immediately as an image not made by human hands, and that they attributed it as the image of the Messiah, and began venerating it. So we're not sure exactly how long it had been there before that, but it was long enough that people had forgotten about it. Okay, let's go back. There, I'm sorry. Let's see. Okay, there's the walls. You can see it's pretty tall up with stone. Okay, so when we went in 2015, we went on a pilgrimage to Italy. We saw the shroud in Turin, and then we also went to the catacombs in Rome. And we could see they had the drawings on the walls. That's where the early Christians worshipped, so they wouldn't get caught and persecuted. But Jesus is portrayed in early art as a noble Roman with a round face, curly hair, and a toga, not the way we picture him today. And St. Augustine at one point reported at the end of the 300s, early 400s, no one knows what the Christ looked like. But all of a sudden, when the cloth was discovered in the walls of Edessa, we see this icon, the Christ Pantocrator. It's a very famous icon. And monks would come to the cloth in Edessa and make copies of it and use it and go out and evangelize as far as Georgia, Russia. And so in the old ruins, there's lots of tile for entrances of homes that would have this image on it. Unfortunately, a lot of churches were destroyed by the Muslims over the years. But it looks like there was a very well-known and well-revered image that was all through the Eastern faith. Now, when the scientific exploration happened in the 1900s, art people started comparing the image. So the question is the image in Edessa the same one as what we know as the Shroud of Turin? Because there's a gap in the history. And so it's trying to fill in the gap. And so they would look. So here we have Jesus with a long, narrow face, hair parted in the middle, long with a beard. We can see one eye is a little bit bigger than the other. And so there was a number of points of congruence between the image that's on the shroud and this picture and the other icons that say that they must have had some familiarity with each other. So from Edessa was taken over by the Muslims, but the Muslims revered it very much and were protecting it. But the emperor in Constantinople wanted it, and he sent 50,000 soldiers down, 200 Muslims, and a lot of money, saying, we're not here to vanquish you, we just want the shroud that you have. They didn't want to part with it. They felt like it was really protected the city. They sent to Baghdad to get permission. And they said, well, for the sake of the 200 Muslim prisoners, we'll part with it. So it goes to Constantinople. We know it was in Constantinople. The same cloth that was in Edessa was also in Constantinople. So in between, we had iconoclasm where in the Eastern Empire, they were breaking down anything they thought was idolatrous. But this was clearly not made by human hands, which protected it. Now, some people say it couldn't be the shroud because all that they ever saw was the face. It was also called the tetradiplon in Greek, which means folded in four twice. So if you take this length, fold it in half and fold it in four, you can get just the face showing. Since the body is naked out of reverence for our Lord, it would make a lot of sense to just show his face. Here's the city of Constantinople. It was, Constantine had built it in 325, and Rome had fallen in the 500s. This was a beacon of Christianity. And there were lots of relics here, lots of wealth. And So here you can see the general bringing the cloth from Edessa to the emperor. And what's so interesting about this is you can see the face kissing the face of the emperor kissing the face on the cloth, but the cloth is not just a little headpiece. There's lots of material, which would point to the fact that it was a lot longer than just the head. Am I blocking your view over here? Okay, 1204. So the East and West Church split in 1054. And so you had the Latin Church and the Orthodox Church. And then you also had the Crusades. So I think this was the fourth Crusade, and there was a Knights Templar on the Crusade. Now there was a, I'm going to say Geoffrey de Clary, Robert de Clary was a Knight Templar, and he has a written account that on a church, Mary Blachernay, on Fridays, there was a contraption that would raise the cloth of Jesus and lower it. So again, it makes it sound like it's much more than a headcloth, but it has length to it. In 1204, a terrible thing happened. That's a black mark even today between the East and West. The Knights, Europe was not wealthy at this time. Knights had spent all their money to raise armies and go to the Crusades, and they go in Constantinople. They're no longer the same church, and they've got all this money, and they did terrible things, as well as sack all the relics and run off with them. So the emperor wrote to the Pope complaining about it and said he thought the shroud was in Greece. It's a mysterious period where it seems to have disappeared for about 125 years. There are a couple of vague references that it might be, but nothing's nailed down. I'm having trouble with the clicker. There we go. Okay, it appears in 1353 in Liry, France, with Geoffrey de Charnay, also a Knights Templar. Very good reputation. He's a standard bearer for the king. And he starts showing it in a church. Now, it's a collegiate church. It wasn't a diocesan church. It wasn't under the authority of the local bishop. The local bishop thought that they were overdoing the reverence to the cloth. They would have candles and processions, and he thought it was idolatrous. My husband says maybe he wanted the money that was coming in as well. So he wrote a letter to the Pope. This was during the time of several popes. So the Pope was in Avignon, France, and he wrote a letter saying, I know I have the person who painted this letter, painted the picture, and I had the proof to do it, but he never provided the artist, but he said he wrote the letter that he did, and he wanted the reference to the shroud to stop. He said it's a forgery. Geoffrey de Charnay also wrote a letter to the Pope. The Pope sided with Geoffrey and told the bishop, if you keep on, you're going to get excommunicated, so back off. But he also told Geoffrey de Charnay, back off on all the candles in the processions. Geoffrey was killed in battle protecting the king of France. And so it went to his wife, and his wife handed it on to their daughter, Margaret. And maybe because they didn't want all this back and forth about the church, she took it with her everywhere she went when she traveled from castle to castle in northern France. But she was getting older. She didn't have any children. So she was looking for a safe place to take the shroud. And so here's a picture that it was a wooden church, but here's a picture of the church at Liry, France. She gave it to the House of Savoy, which their star was rising, and they became much more prominent as the centuries went on. So in 1453, they took possession, and they owned the shroud up until the last king died in 1983 when he deeded it to the living Pope. So Pope Francis technically owns it right now. But they also traveled around with it and eventually put it in Chambéry, France, which is a beautiful town, foot of the mountains. But in 1532, a fire broke out. 4 people had keys to get into where the shroud was kept locked to keep it safe. They couldn't find any of the 4 people. So a blacksmith took a crowbar and pried it open. The silver casket the shroud was in was starting to melt. They took it outside and poured water on it. And so all these burn marks showed up on the shroud. And the poor Clares kneeling stitched on patches that you can see in blue. And if you come up here, if you have good eyes, you'll be able to see the stitch marks of their stitches on the patches. Now, one of the things to note, this is going to be really important later on. See these little holes? They make little L-shaped poker holes. They're repeated. It's not always as clear here and down there. So you can also see how it was folded up by the burn marks. Those poker holes are going to be really, really important. Somebody had done a drawing of the shroud back like 1516, before the fire. Those poker holes were already on it before the fire, and you'll see why they're so important later on. But so it survived, the image survived the fire. And then the Savoys, for political reasons, safety reasons, and also Charles Borromeo, who was in Milan, said he was going to cross the Alps by foot to see the shroud. So they used that as a reason to come to Turin, Italy. Chambray didn't want to let it go, but that was a good reason they gave. And it's been in Turin ever since. This is the Guarini Chapel, where it was kept above the altar. Beautiful, beautiful chapel. Barry Schwartz took a lot of photographs of it. Now, anybody see Monument Men with Hitler wanting all the, okay. So during the World War II, one of the things Hitler wanted to do was he wanted to take all the art treasures of Europe and have them all for himself. And so the people in Turin and the king squirreled the shroud away and hid it here in Montevergine, Italy for the 6 years. The monks only saw it one time. They didn't want anybody to know where it was. And then since then, it's been back in Turin. Then an arsonist set a fire and the Guarini Chapel went ablaze. And again, it was hard to get to it. They had a fireman, it was special bulletproof glass, and he just kept taking a sledgehammer until he could break it down at risk to his own life, and he carried it out. They quickly took it apart, opened it up, and it was safe. The cloth wasn't burned. So that brings us to the scientific explosion with Secondo Pia in 1898. So Secondo Pia was a mayor in northern Italy, the town of Este. He was a mayor. He loved to promote the artworks of northern Italy. And he was also an amateur photographer. So photography had been out for like 50 years, but it was still very much in its infancy. He was self-taught. There were no manuals, no schools, no YouTube to tell him how to take pictures. So most of you are probably old enough to remember when you had to do negatives, but back here you had to have a plate in the back. And you can see the light would come in here, and he would experiment to find out how long do I need to keep the aperture open to get a good print on the back. So he got permission. There was going to be an exhibit of the shroud. I skipped parts of it. While it was in Chambray and Turin over the centuries, sometimes it was every year for Holy Week, and other times it was only when you had a coronation or baptism or wedding that the shroud was shown. It's so long that you always had like 4 or 5 bishops standing up in a tower holding it out for everybody to venerate. And so they were going to have another showing in 1898. It hadn't been shown since the 1860s. And so Secondo Pia said, okay, I'll bring my art treasures down that you're asking for if you'll let me take a picture of the shroud. So the idea of taking a picture of a holy object was they were scared it might do something to the holiness, but he finally got permission to take 2 pictures. So he comes in he has to set up scaffolding because it's a shroud's 9 feet in the air. And he goes to take a picture and the generator for the light broke. Like my husband says, there were no Home Depots or Lowe's to go to get replacements. So somehow he got a replacement. He had to wait several days when the crowd had gone and go back, get the scaffolding, put it back up, and all the hardware had disappeared. So he used baling wire to hold it up. Now, so the scaffolding is being held together with baling wire. He's got this big, heavy camera. He has to hold it open for 14 minutes to get the picture. So it has to be totally still that whole time. So he gets the picture. He goes across the street and to his apartment, puts it in the solution. It's late at night. Do the negative, and then he pulls it up. That's what he saw. He said his knees started trembling. He said, I'm seeing the face of Jesus for the first time in 2,000 years. So news spread. People came to see it and were really impressed. They didn't have a way of sending photographs across the wires to like England and America. So people couldn't really grasp this. They only had drawings that people had made. But a French scientist, very much part of the Science Academy of Paris, full of atheists and agnostics, was so impressed with this, he had his assistant, I'm going to forget his name, but do an examination. He was so impressed that in 1902, he gave a presentation to the Scientific Academy in Paris on the shroud, saying they thought they knew how the image had been formed. And he said, do we know any other person in history that's been scourged, crucified, pierced in the side, dead but not decomposed than Jesus Christ? And there was a huge uproar and it made the papers. But then this great Jesuit art historian, Chevalier, he was a known art authority on fraudulent relics and exposing them. He knew about the letter that Bishop Darcy had written back in the 1300s, and he said, see, it's a forgery. We've got proof. Here's the letter that shows that it was painted. But the person who'd been examining it, there's no paint marks on it. He said, there's no paint marks on it. It's, and also as an artist, when you get close to it, the image disappears. You have to stand back. He said, no artist can paint something you can't see close up. You know, so they didn't, but it cast doubt on the whole authenticity of this image. And they said that Segunda Pia had doctored the image. And so he had to live with that until 1930 and 1933, when the shroud was again exhibited. And this time they had another, Henri took photographs with everybody watching him develop it. Photography in advance, and he took enlargements that showed the herringbone weave on the material and other details that hadn't been able to see before. And it just sparked all kinds of interest in the shroud. And that's when they started comparing it to the icons in that we saw earlier. And so Cardinal Peter Rinaldi in America was very interested, and he kept trying to get the king to allow a scientific examination of the shroud. And the king wouldn't budge. Until, I'm sorry, I jumped ahead of myself. So for those who aren't familiar with negatives, here's Barry Schwartz, positive, and the negative. So you can see how they look distorted. But for the shroud, the actual cloth is the distortion, and the negative is actually a positive. There's nothing else in history it's been like that. If there was an artist who did it, why didn't he do it again? Why would you do something that nobody's going to know about for hundreds of years? Some people think it was Leonardo da Vinci. He wasn't born for 100 years after that was seen for the first time in France. So okay, so the negative is a positive. And so people were looking, you know, were amazed at all the details that show up. So some of the details, just to show you the face, if you saw the face, one of the people that examined it in 1978, they were agnostic, but they said, here's somebody who suffered so much. And look at the peace on the face. They were just so amazed by that. You can see all the scourge marks. You can see it's a naked body. You can see there's 4 fingers. There's no thumb. The right hand is over the left. Those are all details that they use to compare it to some other things that we'll see. So in 1976, there was a VP8 image analyzer. It was used for espionage and secret stuff that Barry wouldn't talk about it. And so I'm not a scientist, and even though they explain what it does, it's just like over my head. But the people who knew the technology of it were amazed when John Jackson said, hey, look, I've got a picture of the shroud. What happens if we stick that in the image analyzer? So they did that. He was taught physics at the Air Force Academy, and they put it in, and all of a sudden you see there's 3-dimensionality in this picture. So if this was a forgery from the Middle Ages, not only did the forger put in reverse imaging, he also put in 3-dimensionality. So again, that's a lot of technology for the Middle Ages. It was also verified. And again, if you took a regular photograph, you get distorted pictures. You don't get the same thing. So Aldrich Sherry did edge enhancement, also came up with 3-dimensionality. And so based on that, John Jackson said, we've got to get permission. We've got to get over there and do an examination. They got permission from the king. They got about 20 of the top scientists from IBM, Lockheed Martin, JPL Labs, Sandia Labs. Bill's been to those places, and he says it's places where you think aliens would go around behind the buildings in the desert. But to get permission, they did like an 1.5-inch packet of all the experiments they were going to do. The king said you can't hurt the shroud. So they came up with a special holding table to hold it upright where they wouldn't have to put tacks in it. It was magnetic, it was mylar. 3M developed special sticky tape for them that wouldn't leave any residue the way tape often does. So they were really careful in what they did. They took 80 crates of equipment. I think it was $70 million worth of equipment back in the 1978. Top technology back then. Barry says, of course, we've come a long way since then. But it got stuck in the airport. One of the boxes was marked radioactive, do not touch. And the airport authorities wouldn't let them in. A cardinal had to intervene. They had 5 days and nights. Somebody joked, why don't you just empty the dump truck, empty it up and drop it all on the ground. But they had to take it to the 2nd floor. They didn't have any dollies or elevators. They had to hand carry all the crates up to the 2nd floor. So they brought the shroud in, and Barry said, you could have heard a pin drop. The Americans are over here with, oops, that's not what I wanted to do. Yep. Sorry. Okay. The Americans over here with their hands behind their back because the Italians over here said, you touch the shroud and we'll kill you. They got their hands behind their back. Now over here, it's hard to see, but this is the mylar table they had constructed with magnets to hold the shroud. And it took them a long time to get it together. But so Barry was a non-practicing Jewish person at the time. He thought, we'll get over there and we'll just see it's a forgery and we'll have 5 days to be around in Italy. One glance at it told him, it's not a painting. It's not, it's something mysterious. It's something to examine. So I'm going to go through these. So here's when they first looked at it. This John Jackson back over here. This is Ray Rogers and Max Fry, a German scientist. What they did is they undid some of the backing cloth that the nuns had put on to protect the shroud to see, did the image go through the shroud? Nobody had seen the back of the shroud for hundreds of years. The image, they couldn't see any image on the back of the shroud. So they had two objectives. Was the blood on the shroud real human blood? And how was the image made? So all these tests are pretty much trying to do that. So the Italians were vacuum endoscopic camera put between the shroud and the backing cloth, and they would vacuum it out in sections, put it in a Ziploc bag, and then they were going to take it back and analyze it. In some of the pictures, you can see what they did is they put like a string grid over the shroud so they could tell where different things came from. So here's X-ray radiography. They're looking at the blood stains. So Barry said there was a long hallway. There was one bathroom for all these 20 plus men. There was Americans, Germans, and Italians. And that was the only place that they could use the dark room because they still had, dark room technology. So on a human level, it made it interesting. And they didn't sleep for 5 days practically. So the X-rays, they look at it and they can see a serum halo around the blood. So it was real human blood. Here's a close-up and you can see the string grid they used. They use infrared reflectance spectroscopy, infrared thermography, infrared photography. Again, they're trying to see, if the image wasn't done by paint, was it a scorch? Did they take a statue and heat it and put the cloth on it? And then that made the image on it. Trying to see how did the image get there? UV reflectance and fluorescence spectroscopy. The photomicroscopy. So what they did is they did a close-up. So here you can see the herringbone weave, 3 over, 1 under, when you have the top and bottom, the upright and the horizontal weave of the cloth. It's a very expensive weave, but they weren't textile experts. They were mostly looking to see it's the blood. So the blood saturated into the fibers of the cloth, like you would expect. The image did not go into the fibers of the cloth. It rested, like if you took a human hair, about half the diameter of a human hair, it's all the deeper the image is in the cloth. It's like floating on the very top. So the blood is underneath the image. And you can just take a razor blade and make it disappear. It was a series of pixels, the whole length, the same density, which a painter couldn't do. The images formed when the pixels are close together is where you get more coloration. So here's UV fluorescence photography. So they're looking at the sphere wound in the side, which is also where there's a patch. There's a serum halo that's visible only with UV fluorescence photography. So again, a forger wouldn't have known those details. So here's Barry when he was young. He did reflected and transmitted light photography. What he did is here's the grid, and here's the number 3 blood stain on the forehead. So when you put light behind it, you can see the blood. And here's a ventral shroud with the transmitted light. So you can see when they put the light behind, you can see the patch marks, you can see the water stains, you can see the blood marks, but the image of the shroud disappears. There's nothing on the cloth to stop the image. The image is not made with any pigment or anything of substance. Light can pass right through it. Here's their sticky tape samples. They removed surface material for chemical analysis. They found that on the knees, there was dirt. When they analyzed it, they found it was travertine argonite. It's a rare composition for dirt found on the streets of Jerusalem and not many other places. Again, if you were a forger, do you think you'd take the knees and dip them in the dirt of Jerusalem? They also have found pollen that, so a Jewish scientist has identified as flowers growing only in Jerusalem. It's not somebody with, trying to prove it. He didn't have an axe to grind about it. So they took the samples, put them in special holders, and that's what they analyzed for 3 years after the examination. So at the end of 3 years, they said the answer to the question of how the image was produced or what produced the image remains now, as it has been in the past, a mystery. We can conclude for now that the shroud image is that of a real human form of a scourged, crucified man. It is not the product of an artist. The blood stains are composed of hemoglobin and also give a positive test for serum albumin. The image is an ongoing mystery, and until further chemical studies are made, perhaps by this group of scientists or perhaps by some scientists in the future, the problem remains unsolved. So they did all that work and they didn't come up with an answer. But everything pointed to them to being authentic. Now, the gold standard at that time was radiocarbon dating. But radiocarbon dating, you need to burn the material, and the size sample was the size of a handkerchief. And nobody wanted to take something that large from the shroud to burn it up to do carbon dating. So a few years later in the 80s, someone came up with a technique where they only needed a sample the size of a postage stamp. So after some reluctance, they got permission to do radiocarbon dating. So if you may remember some of the results, but what happened is they had a protocol and they broke almost every single one of the protocols. It was supposed to go to 7 labs doing 2 different techniques, went down to 3 labs doing the same technique. They were supposed to have control fabric, so people wouldn't know if they had a piece of the shroud or some other ancient artifact. They found herringbone weave in cotton or silk, but not in linen. They found linen, but not in the herringbone weave. So when they went there, everybody knew they were getting a piece of the shroud. When they got there, they took an hour and a half to decide where to take the cloth, to take the sample. And so I'll have a slide of that in a little bit, but up here, you can see there's a patch, and they ended up taking it from right underneath the patch. So all those hundreds of showings where people are holding it, they took it from near there. Maybe they didn't want to damage the image, but it wasn't a very good place to take it from. I jumped ahead of myself. So it's not a painting. The image color is insoluble in all 25 solvents. It's not a scorch from a heated statue. It doesn't fluoresce under UV illumination. It's not a rubbing of iron oxide. It doesn't consist of iron oxide. There's a few flecks, but that would just be in the linen. It's not a medieval photograph. It was not produced by any light process, and no silver salts were found. It's not the product of an artist. It's not produced by bodily secretions. In other words, the body never decomposed. It didn't turn to mush and make an image. It's still in rigor mortis. So they did the radiocarbon dating. One of the other things was the 3 labs weren't supposed to communicate to each other, but they did. So it was in Oxford, Arizona, and Switzerland. And so you can see they called it a medieval fraud. So all the people in the STIRP team were like, how come this one test throws out everything that pointed to it being real? And so people were saying, well, maybe the medieval fire in the 1500s did something, maybe all the hands, maybe all, so they had a lot of theories on why do we get this result? But it pretty much quenched people calling it a real thing. And then so they took it from a single strip, about a ½ inch by 3, just over 3 inches, and cut it up in parts and divvied it out. Now in 2005, Sue Benford got buried, and they went to Ray Rogers, a world-renowned chemist who had been on the Shroud team, and said, we think there's a problem with the sample they took as far as the material. And so Ray Rogers was like, look, they said it's medieval, that's it. And they said, please, just go look at it under your electron microscope. I'll be back in 10 minutes. 45 minutes later, he came back and he said, you're right. They had dyed, there was a cotton thread that had been dyed, and he had a couple of threads. And so he wrote a paper saying the radiocarbon dating, the sample was flawed. It was later backed up in August of 2008. Researchers from Los Alamos National Laboratory further validate Rogers' findings that they had tapestry artists that could, repair tapestries, and that's what had happened. Now, one of the things that really clinches it is after all this discussion, this Hungarian Pray manuscript, there's a monk named Pray, had gone to Constantinople, had written this book in Hungary. It was bound and kept in Hungary because it was their first written book in the Hungarian language. So we know when he was in Constantinople between 1192 and 1195, we know the shroud from Edessa was in Constantinople because it's before it was raided at 1204. So this image really helps validate that the cloth that was in Edessa and Constantinople is the same cloth as the shroud, because we see, let me see if I can get this. We see the herringbone weave. We see a naked body. We see the 4 fingers, which if you put a nail through here, it jerks the thumb in. We see the right hand over the left. But here's the other thing is, oh dear. Okay, you see, if you can see, there's little holes. Those are those L-shaped poker holes I said were important. We know they were on the cloth in Constantinople. We know they were on the cloth in Turin before the fire, and they're on this cloth that we can see now. It had to be the same cloth. We're not sure whether the holes are from incense. There was a trial by fire that was supposed to be alleged early on. It could have been somebody testing it, but it helps clinch that it's the same material. Professor Giulio Fanti found these coins from the 600s. And so on one side is the image that we know from the icon in Edessa. And he says, you couldn't just make up an image, you had to look at the actual thing. So you couldn't just make the emperor look nicer than he was, you had to do an actual image. So again, it's the same image with the bruised eye, the broken nose, the plucked beard. So again, it ties to the image that's on the Shroud of Turin that we have. Here's one of the times when the shroud was on display. Millions of people, when we went, they gave you a time to be there and you had a little line, so you didn't have a long wait. Here we see Pope Benedict and Pope John Paul II venerating the shroud. They believed in its authenticity. Let me see what the next one is. Okay, then we'll get to the Passion. But just in August of this year, there was a new scientific revelation or finding that again helps validate that the shroud is authentic. It's called WAX, wide-angled X-ray, scattered X-ray scattering. And they took little pieces of the fiber and did some analysis of it and charted its pattern and found that it matched the patterns of other material from the 1st century. If they tried it with material from the Middle Ages, it didn't match at all. So they're saying, again, it validates that what we have in Turin goes all the way back to the 1st century.
Thank you all for being here. About point, I wanted to point out more evidence of why the shroud is truly the authentic burial cloth of Christ. In 2015, National Geographic went down into the tomb of Christ and they took off the top piece of stone and they found another piece of stone under there, which they think was actually the resting place for the body of Jesus. Their equipment failed to function. There was so much radioactivity in the tomb of Christ that their equipment wouldn't function. They publicized that briefly, and then there was nothing more said about it. But I think that the herringbone weave, the soil from Golgotha and Jerusalem on the knees and on the feet, and the pollen from the flowers from the Holy Land is pure evidence that the shroud really is the burial cloth of Jesus. Here we see Mel Gibson's portrayal of the Last Supper, Jesus lifting the bread and the wine and saying, "This is my body." He didn't shy away from saying, "This is like my body." He said, "This is my body." And he had said, "Unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you will have no parts in me." And people were leaving him. They thought that he was speaking of cannibalism. On the contrary, he was saying, what greater love is there that a man give up his life for his friends? Before Jesus came, it was an eye for an eye, a tooth for tooth. And he changed the way they were thinking. But he also threatened the high priest because they were living a very high life based on the income from the temple. And Jesus had huge crowds following him. And so they were afraid that their income, their lifestyle was threatened by him, and that people were going to start following Jesus. Around Jerusalem, there were vertical poles, and it would be impossible for a person to carry a whole cross because it would be 350 pounds. And the patibulum, the crossbeam, weighed about between 60 and 80 pounds. And so they carry the crossbeam, there was a hole in that would slide down over the vertical post. And that was the only way that it could be done. But meanwhile, while those people hung on the cross throughout Jerusalem, up to 500 a day, Pilate would kill. Dogs would come and gnaw on their feet and on their legs, and birds would pluck their eyes. And so Jesus knew what to anticipate with the crucifixion. Of course he did. He was God. He knew it all. And so after he had instituted the Eucharist at the Last Supper, he went down through the Kidron Valley and into the Garden of Gethsemane. And he left Peter and James and John a little bit away from him, and he went off to pray to his Father. And he was tempted, severely tempted by Satan. And he wanted the cup to pass. But in order for us to get to heaven, he had to take on all the sins of the world. And that's why he felt so alienated from his Father, because he had all the sins of all time on him. He went back to Peter, James, and John, and they were asleep. 3 times that happened. And then he heard the soldiers coming, and he asked them, who were they looking for? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. And he said, I'm he. Malchus, in the little skirmish, Peter cut off Malchus's ear, and Jesus immediately and healed him. And they hauled Jesus off to Annas's house. And Annas was the former high priest. And it was just out of respect for him that they stopped. And they were kind of proud, I think, that they had control of Jesus. They had finally captured him. And maybe they could put an end to this threat to their high lifestyle. And so after beating Jesus some at Annas's, he was pushed on to Caiaphas. Caiaphas had a little deal going with Tiberius. Caiaphas would send money to Tiberius, and Tiberius would send soldiers to protect the Jews in Jerusalem. So Caiaphas certainly didn't want that little relationship damaged. So Caiaphas beat Jesus, interrogated Jesus, and at one point, Jesus claimed that he was God. Well, Caiaphas tore his clothing and said, that's blasphemy. He beat him further and put him into a cell in the basement of his house, lowered him by ropes into this pit in the basement of his house. And Bill had a woman come up to him, and she said it was so dark and damp, frightening down there. And so that's where Jesus spent the night. Then in the morning, they hauled him up, and they took him to Pilate. And Pilate's wife, Claudia, had had a dream. In her dream, she was told, have nothing to do with this man. So she ran to her husband and told him, stay, don't touch him. And Pilate interrogated Jesus, and he felt that Jesus was innocent because Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this world. Pilate believed him. So Pilate sent him on to Herod. Herod was delighted to have him because his father had tried to kill all the baby boys 2 years and under, hoping to get Jesus 32 years prior to that. And so he had a ball with him. He put him in a robe. He mocked him and beat him more. In fact, they used a stick 1 3/4 inches and hit his right eye so badly that it was closed. And so then they took Jesus back to Pilate. Well, Pilate thought, maybe I'll gamble. I will have him beaten so badly that they will definitely say that we'll let him go. So he told the soldiers, don't kill them, but beat him so badly. And so his nose was broken, but it's cartilage. So it fulfilled Isaiah's message, prophecy years prior, centuries prior, that not a bone would be broken. His beard was split and plucked, which was the highest insult to a Middle Eastern man. And I gave my back to those who strike and my cheeks to those who pull out the beard. I hid not my face from disgrace and spitting. And that's the crucifixion was the highest form, and passion, the highest form of humiliation. They used a Roman flagrum, and it's thought that Jesus probably was struck 120 times. Jewish law said 39 times is all they could do, but the Romans didn't care about Jewish law. And it's possible that he was struck 120 times. Each flagrum had between 4 and 8 strips of leather with bones, glass, metal, spikes, and they used those to strike a taller soldier and a shorter one in order to cover the body back and front. Those scourge marks pulled the skin because of those little balls, those foot and sharp pieces, all the way down the body. Then after they scourged him, he could hardly walk. As a result of the scourging, he revealed to a mystic between about 28,430 drops of blood, he said, Jesus said to the mystic, which is equivalent to about 6 pints. The result of that huge blood loss is disorientation, extreme weakness, nausea, and the beginning of organ failure. So after they beat him within inches of his life, they pulled him into the Praetorium. And there were about 850 soldiers in there because of a full cohort, because of the Passover. And they've been ordered to come to preserve peace just in case. Oh my, those soldiers, they hated Jews. And so they relished the opportunity mock him. And he had the robe on, and they went out. One of the soldiers went out, and there was a thorn bush. It's still there to this day, with thorns about 2 to 4 inches long, similar to the crucifix up there, with very long thorns. And they made not a neat plaited crown. They made a helmet and hammered it into his head. And Frederick Zugby, who did a lot of research on the crucifixion, said he thought that the crown of thorns was the most painful aspect of the crucifixion because of all the nerve endings in his head. So you can see his ponytail coming down here. Jewish rabbis wore ponytails. And the blood stains from the crown in the back of his head. During the carrying of the cross, well, let me back up just a little bit. So after they taunted him and mocked him, they said to Jesus, well, let's blindfold him and see if he can guess. If he's God, see if he can guess who it is. So they blindfolded him and they spit on him and they said, who spit on you? Of course he knew. Truth is, it was you and it was me. Every time that we do something, it's us. And they hit him and they said, who did that? He knew. And so after they finished taunting him, they dragged him back to Pilate. Well, Pilate knew that the Jewish law allowed him to free one person at Passover time. So he asked, would they free Barabbas or did they want Jesus? And of course, they chose Jesus. And so at that point, Pilate assigned 4 soldiers and they dragged Jesus. They had to enlist the help of Simon of Cyrene quickly because Jesus was so weak from all that blood loss and all the beating that he had endured. So Simon helped him carry the cross, and they went outside the city wall. At that moment, he became the new blood sacrifice. Throughout the centuries, all the lambs and calves and doves, after they've been sacrificed as a sin offering, their remains were thrown over the city wall. Jesus was outside the city wall. He was the new blood sacrifice for us. So he climbed the hill of Golgotha, place of the skull. And as Karen explained, they put the nail through the wrist, through the median nerve and caught on the carpal bone, because if they put it higher, his hand would slip through. And so they caught the body there. And mind you, during the course of carrying the cross, one shoulder, the right shoulder, had been dislocated. There was a priest who he was first a doctor and became a priest, and he verified that from the shroud that the right shoulder was dislocated so badly that there's 10 centimeters difference between the right and the left. It was that bad of a dislocation. It's thought possibly there was such a huge blood loss because of that dislocation that Jesus could have died of a heart attack. So they, as you know, put him up on the cross, and the first thing they did after they dropped him over the stipe, hammered his feet in, he turned to his father and he said, I'm trying to hurry a little bit because of time. They said, he turned to the father and he said, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. And then he looked down at his mother and he said to his mother, behold your son. And at that point, all of us became sons and daughters of Mary. And to John, behold your mother. And okay, I was trying to cut that. And so, of course, he said, then I thirst. And the bad thief had taunted him and said, if you're God, get yourself down off of here. And the good thief, Dismas, turned to him and said, we belong here. He doesn't belong, he's innocent. And Jesus, as hard as it was for him to speak, because he had to push up to get oxygen on the nails in his feet in order to elevate his lungs, because his lungs were filling with pleural fluid. He said, today you will be with me in paradise. So we know, as Bill says, the first person we know who was in heaven was a thief. So hopefully there's room for all of us. And so after they the sun had disappeared at noon, and it was total blackness, they said, and it was verified through science that there was, at that time, total blackness for 3 hours. Oddly enough, at 3 o'clock, they say there are no coincidences, all the lambs, that was the hour that all the lambs were killed. And that was the hour, of course, that Christ died. And as when Jesus, he was first called, when he passed by John the Baptist said, "Behold the Lamb." So he truly was the Lamb of God, taken on all the sins of the world. Well, when he died, huge earthquake. The curtain in the temple, which was about 3 to 4 inches thick, split in half, 60 feet long from top to bottom, complete split. What did it reveal? The Holy of Holies was then laid open, and the Holy of Holies was on Golgotha, on Calvary. It was Jesus. He was the Holy of Holies now. So what do we have here? We have the patches, of course, and all the wounds, the 4 fingers, the blood stains, which were shown to be really, I think O is the universal donor, but they were shown to be the universal donor's blood, of course, for all of us. Before taking him down, they had to make sure he was dead. So Longinus took a spear and put it through between the 5th and 6th rib into the pleural cavity and into the pericardial cavity, and blood and water immediately rushed out. If it had been air, he would still be alive, but it was blood and water, so I knew he was dead. And before taking him off the cross, they put the sudarium, which was a piece of cloth about 3 feet or so square, over his head, just out of respect. And the sudarium matches almost identically with the face on the cross, on the Shroud of Turin. So they took him down, they broke the rigor because the rigor had already set in, and put a foot in his armpit and pulled his arm up and gave him to his mother. And then after that, Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea put him into Joseph's tomb. And of course, back in those days, they had to have the burial cloth ready because you didn't have, as Bill would say, you didn't have intensive care. You had, if you died, you got sick, you died, you had to have your burial cloth ready. So it's very in keeping that a very expensive cloth with a herringbone pattern would have belonged to Joseph of Arimathea. And then, of course, we know what happened we believe on Easter morning. One thing about the shroud, which you can notice over here, it's thought possibly that the radiation from the resurrection was the cause of putting this image on the shroud. And it's evidenced here because it's so thin, right on the top surface. It's 0.00028 of an inch thick, half the size of a human hair. And if you look at this image, the back image of Jesus, you can see that he's standing, and that is perfect with the resurrection. Well, here's the nail going through the ankle. Frederick Zuckerby, testing on his son. Salvador Dali, with Jesus the Father looking down on Jesus, Jesus looking down on us. The sudarium matching with the face of Christ on the shroud in many points of congruency. And the burial, of the way they buried with Jesus lying. Okay. right, let's go. It had to be the resurrection, being on the very top of the fibers, just like in Guadalupe, that image is on the very top fibers. So no image formed under the blood stains. That's very important. It was on top of the blood, the last thing to have happened. No sign of decomposition, no parts of the body still in rigor. Shows parts of the body still in rigor, and rigor leaves the body after 60 hours, which puts it in the time frame of the resurrection. There's no distortion present. The density is the same throughout, caused by an image of pixels or that flash that would have put it just like in Nagasaki, Hiroshima. That image on the side of the buildings there is just a flash image of those people. The negative is a positive. It's still an article of faith, but science can't prove how that image was formed. The greatest adventure in life is to seek God, which you're all doing, obviously, or you wouldn't be here. The greatest achievement in life is to find God in the hope you have. And the greatest romance in life is to fall in love with God, who loves us more than you can even imagine. This is what I gave you. I gave you myself. I laid down my life for you. And this is what I give you at Mass, every opportunity that we have. He gives us himself again. Thanks for coming. I know there's a rush for Mass.
We're sitting, so we have to start breaking everything down.
Turn this off too.